a state of chaos in Ecuador, where President Guillermo Lasso has dissolved the National Assembly and taken on dictatorial powers. The armed forces and national police of the country, in public statements, said they support that decision. President Lasso has called for early elections, and he will, until then, rule by decree. For more on that, we go to Stephen Sefton in Esteli, Nicaragua, and Camila Escalante in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Stephen, Camila, this situation is not confined to Ecuador. There are a number of other places where this is happening in the region. Camila, why don't you start and explain to us what's happening in Ecuador?
Well, just a few hours ago, we saw the president of Ecuador, Guillermo Lasso, who's this right-wing banker. He owns one of the major banks there. That's Banco Guayaquil. But he has his hands in a lot of other things. He has this entire administration that is just made up of really just, financial elites and people who will go after and protect their interests in the country. And he decided to dissolve the National Assembly, something that's going to be looked at by some courts, and which is being called an illegal move by some of his actual former allies. And he's going to be ruling by decree for the next 6 months. That means that a lot of people, such as the leader of the CONAIE, the largest indigenous movement there, its leader, Leonidas Iza, has called it a dictatorship because he'll be ruling by decree. He has the backing of the military, and he has instructed that the National Electoral Council, the CNE, begin the process of organizing legislative and presidential elections, which should take place in 6 months. But this is all happening due to this constant, and he calls it a grave political crisis, since he came into power. He's only been in office for a couple of years, but since then we've seen, we've seen just a total lack of control of the situation in terms of the security situation in the country. We have transnational criminal organizations coming in. We see prison riots and just very stark levels of violent crime in the country, and a lot of corruption, among other things. And the social movements have been trying to push and pressure from below for some changes, but it seems as if this government was never going to last to begin with. So we're going to see what happens. There's a lot of reactions coming from different directions, one of which, of course, is former President Rafael Correa, who has said that this is an illegal move. And, they're saying that this is a dictatorship. There's now a possibility that the Correistas, those of the Citizens' Revolution, the main left-wing force in the country, could actually take back power in these upcoming elections.
Stephen, this is literally a dictatorship under the term that you use in political economy that comes from the Roman structure. When you had some sort of an emergency, then someone became dictator. That was the actual name for it. And they ruled by decree. And that's what we're looking at here.
I think it's worth pointing out that there's a political electoral crisis from the point of view of Guillermo Lasso, because as Camila pointed out, former President Correa's group, and Andrea Arauz, who was their presidential candidate in the elections that Guillermo Lasso eventually won. And they had a very good result in recent, I think it was provincial elections, local elections, in which they made huge advances in terms of their representation at municipal and provincial level. So from Lasso's point of view, that was a very ominous sign. And of course, that political electoral crisis is linked to the economic crisis. Ecuadorian economy is not doing well. And as Camila pointed out, the security situation in Ecuador is worse than it's ever been. For example, with the numerous killings on the streets, and also extremely serious violence in the country's prisons.
Yeah. Camila, you were going to say something?
Yeah, just to reiterate that this is what it's called is Muerte Cruzada, which is, it's being called a dictatorship because Guillermo Lasso himself will have the power to guide the laws and regulations that are put in place in the country unilaterally. And just after he made his 15-minute declaration to the nation, we saw another set of statements from the armed forces and the police standing there saying that they will support this measure. Yeah. And so it does seem like he'll remain in power for these rest of the 6 months, but now like I said, the CONAIE, the indigenous movements, are going to take to an assembly, as they always do. They're going to refer to the basis, and they're going to see what kind of actions they're going to take next, whether it be mobilizations in the streets and things like that. But in Ecuador, not only under this administration, but in the previous administration of Lenin Moreno, we saw a lot of state of exceptions. We saw a lot of brutal police repression, and they made it absolutely impossible for people to go out and demonstrate in the streets. And that's what people have shown that they want to do during this administration, opposing every move. And so, we're going to see what takes place in terms of if they'll accept this decision. We have both, a very large and powerful and influential indigenous movement, but on the other hand, we also have this left-wing, Rafael Correa-aligned citizens' revolution, which also were extremely successful in these latest local elections that took place like 2 months ago. So, they are in a very good position to retake power potentially in the country.
Ecuador has been turned, I guess, by the United States. We went from Rafael Correa, who was a progressive. He was aligned with Venezuela and Nicaragua and even Cuba, and a very progressive voice on the continent. And then we had Lenin Moreno, who was elected essentially as a successor to Correa, who was term limited out. And he turned as soon as he got in and became a close ally of the United States. We went from that to what we have now, what we're hearing, today.
Yeah, and I think, as Camila has pointed out on more than one occasion, and all these signs of destabilization, all these crises that take place in countries where the local elites are strong, and often these right-wing elites have been in government. They're strongly aligned with the United States, and so. If you look across the region, if you look at what's happening in Peru, for example, in Argentina, you can see that wherever, or even Colombia for that matter, you can see that wherever the right-wing elites are strongly aligned with the United States, which they generally are in the region, there's moves towards crisis. And this latest example in Ecuador is only one of the most extreme. And if the situation in Argentina is also extremely difficult for the current relatively progressive government of Alberto Fernandez, largely as a result of foreign debt entanglements contrived by the previous right-wing administration, leading to the IMF returning to have control over Argentina's economy, among other things. And in Colombia, you can see something similar, where the right-wing elites there are now mobilizing more and more actively to prevent Gustavo Petro, the president there, from implementing his really relatively progressive program. And this latest crisis in Ecuador is, I'm sure Camila agrees, just another example of the malign influence of U.S. imperialism in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we saw come out on this large news program in Ecuador is the Interior Minister of Guillermo Lasso came out shortly after he took power in the country and said that he was actually appointed essentially on the request, or he got a recommendation from the U.S. Embassy in Quito, and that's how he decided who their interior minister would be. Wow. And if you look at the recent history of Ecuador, this is an extremely important post in the country. Obviously, it's an extremely important position in any country, the interior minister, but this interior minister that was essentially appointed by the U.S. Embassy has overseen all of the deaths and killings in the prisons across the country, all of the riots, all of the extreme levels of violence. So it just shows that literally by mere presence, the United States, which a lot of people says controls and is governing Ecuador, actually helps destabilize and worsen the internal situation of these countries. This is a country that's supposed to have very low levels of crime during the years of Rafael Correa, and that crime and the levels of violence have shot up in the period since.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll go out with a reminder for the audience that the benevolent hand of the United States has brought democracy and prosperity and stability to countries as varied as Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam, among many others. So nothing's really changed. Thank you, guys. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and we'll speak with you again next week.
Thank you so much, John, and
You're
thanks,
very
Stephen.
welcome, John.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.